All right, everyone, this is Mr. Vanderpool. We're going to move on to a practice problem here. So we're going to graph and explain what would happen to the equilibrium price level, real GDP, unemployment rate, and inflation rate in the short run. Okay, remember, in the short run, wages and input costs are sticky. Okay, they have not adjusted yet, and they adjust in the long run. So our focus here is going to be on the short run. If the economy is in full employment equilibrium and there is an increase in government spending. So this is going to be very similar to the types of problems we're going to be doing for homework and throughout the rest of this PowerPoint. So let's go and take a look at that. All right, so the first thing we have to do is we need to go ahead and put up our ADAS in full employment equilibrium. So we're going to go ahead and set up our model. So we're going to go ahead and draw our X and Y axes. So on our Y axis we have price level represented by the variable PL. On our X axis we have real GDP represented by the variable GDPR. Then we have our ADAS in full employment equilibrium here. So we're going to go ahead and draw our long run aggregate supply. And we know right below long run aggregate supply is our full employment output, which we represent with YF. And then we have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve, which we'll call AD. And then our upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve, which we need to make sure intersects where the LRAS hits the aggregate demand. And that is our short run aggregate supply. So now we need to create some equilibriums here. So our equilibrium price level, we're going to go ahead and call P, and then we are at full employment output. Okay, so because we're at full employment output, aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply are intersecting on the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, it's intersecting at full employment. Now, there's an increase in government spending. That increase in government spending is going to increase aggregate demand. Thus, it is going to shift it to the right. So let's go ahead and draw our little arrow here. And we have our new aggregate demand curve, which we will call AD1. Now, where AD1 hits our short run aggregate supply, we're going to have our new equilibrium price level, which we'll call P1. And we have our new equilibrium output, which we will just call Y. Okay? So now, the last thing we need to do is we need to put what happens to output, price level, unemployment, and inflation. So we can tell as we moved from our first equilibrium to our second equilibrium that the price level went up. Okay, so we know the price level went up. We could also tell that output went up from YF to Y. So GDPR is also going to go up. Now, after we've done that, we need to figure out what happens to unemployment and what happens to inflation. Oftentimes, what I'll see students do is this, and I think this is a good idea. Right below price level, we're going to go ahead and write out our inflation rate here. And we know that the inflation rate is going to be moving the same way as the price level, because the inflation rate is just the rate of change in the price level. So if the price level is going up, the rate of change is going up. So therefore, the inflation rate is going to go up. Okay, so we always know that the price level and the inflation rate are going to be moving the same way. Now, if we take a look here at the unemployment rate, we'll put that right below real GDP. The unemployment rate is going to be moving the opposite way of real GDP. And so therefore the unemployment rate is going to be going down. And why is that? Because in this case, real GDP went up, meaning there's more production, meaning there's more hiring, which means that the unemployment rate goes down. Okay? So now we've shifted aggregate demand to the right with that increase in government spending, and we saw that that increased the price level, that increased real GDP, that increased inflation, and that lowered our unemployment rate. All right, so let's look at another example. So here we're going to show an increase in aggregate demand. Now, you take a look at this ADAS graph, you can see we are in a recessionary gap. Output isn't quite up to full employment output. Aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are intersecting before the long-run aggregate supply curve. So generally, if you're in recession, you're going to want to get aggregate demand to shift back to full employment output. So currently where we're at, where aggregate demand meets SRAS, we're at an equilibrium price level, which we represented with P, and then output, which we represented with Y. Now, in response to this recession, the Federal Reserve or the U.S. Congress and the President, through monetary and fiscal policy, when we'll talk about this more at a later time, would implement policies that would increase consumption, increase gross private investment, increase government spending, and or increase net exports. This would imply that aggregate demand would shift to the right, which implies that real GDP goes up and the price level is going to go up. Okay, you can see here that when aggregate demand shifted to the right from 80 to 81, we're now back at full employment output, and the price level has raised from P to P1, and output has raised from Y to YF, because we're back at full employment output. Okay, so when aggregate demand shifted to the right, that implied that real GDP went up and the price level went up, which implied that the unemployment rate went down and the inflation rate went up. Remember, the unemployment rate is going to be going the opposite way of real GDP, and the inflation rate is going to be going the same way as price level. So if the Federal Reserve or the U.S. Congress implemented some sort of policy to increase aggregate demand, you can see that now the economy is back at full employment output. Real GDP has gone up, price level has gone up, unemployment down, and the inflation rate has gone up. Now, let me show you an example of a decrease in aggregate demand. So here, we have an ADAS with an inflationary gap. Output is greater than full employment output. Aggregate demand and short aggregate supply are intersecting beyond the long-run aggregate supply curve. So in this case, you have inflation. What would happen is either the Federal Reserve, or through monetary policy, or the Congress through fiscal policy, would go ahead and implement some sort of policy that would shift aggregate demand to the left, because you want to get aggregate demand back to full employment output. So there would be some sort of policy by a policymaker that would lower consumption, lower gross private investment, lower government spending, or lower net exports. So we can see initially our equilibrium where aggregate demand short-run aggregate supply was at P. Now after the aggregate demand shifted to the left, you can see the price level fell from P to P1, and our output fell from Y to YF. So after the Federal Reserve or the Congress/President implements some sort of policy that lowers consumption, lowers gross private investment, lowers government spending, or lowers net exports, that means aggregate demand is going to shift to the left, which would mean that real GDP, which implies that real GDP is going to be going down, and the price level is going to be going down, which implies that the unemployment rate is going to be going up, and the inflation rate is going to be going down. All right, so we're now going to do the assessment. So for number one, we're going to graph and explain what would happen to the equilibrium price level, real GDP, unemployment rate, and inflation rate in the short run if the economy is in full employment equilibrium. So we start off at full employment equilibrium, and there is a decrease in net exports. Set up your ADAS in full employment equilibrium. Shift aggregate demand the right way. Label everything. And then go ahead and tell me what happens to price level, real GDP, unemployment, and inflation for number one. Okay, if there's a decrease in net exports. Now for number two, we're going to graph and explain what would happen to the equilibrium price level, real GDP, unemployment rate, and inflation rate in the short run. If the economy is in full employment equilibrium, there is an increase in gross private investment. So just like number one, set up your ADAS and full employment output, shift aggregate demand the correct way based on that increase in gross private investment, and then tell me what happens to price level, real GDP, unemployment, and inflation. If you need more time, you can pause. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and move on here. So for the summary, in a paragraph, we're going to go ahead and describe what you've learned today. All right. I will check these tomorrow, and you have a good one. Bye-bye.